There is a moment, just one moment, when a person's whole life can turn. For me, that moment happened on a Tuesday night, at a table set for 8, under the soft yellow light of my parents' dining room. It happened over a plate of roast chicken that was getting cold while my father stood up, tapped his wine glass with a fork, and looked directly at me. "Let's be honest," he said, smiling the way he always smiled right before he hurt someone. "Some of us in this family know how to build something, and some of us just know how to dream." Everyone laughed. My mother laughed. My brother Daniel laughed the loudest, his new Rolex catching the light as he raised his glass. "To Daniel," my father said, "the only child in this family who actually made something of himself." I sat there. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just smiled, picked up my fork, and kept eating, like the words hadn't landed anywhere at all. But they had landed. They landed somewhere deep, somewhere I had been protecting for 6 years, a place where I kept a secret my family didn't know existed. A secret that, in exactly 11 days, was going to change the way every single person at that table looked at me. Because my father didn't know it yet. But he didn't own the house we were sitting in anymore. I did. And in 11 days, he was going to open his mailbox and find a letter with my name on it, not as his daughter, but as his landlord. This is the story of how I went from being called a failure at my own family's dinner table to holding the one piece of paper that made every one of them go silent. This is the story of the deed. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just change my family. It changed the way I understood what it means to actually win. My name is Emily Carter. I was 32 years old the night of that dinner, and to understand why my father's words cut so deep, you need to understand the family I grew up in. We weren't rich, not when I was a kid. My father, Richard Carter, ran a small hardware store in our town for almost 20 years. My mother, Diane, worked part-time at a dentist's office. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Grove Lane, the same house where that dinner happened. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Or at least, that's what I always believed. I have one sibling, my older brother Daniel. Daniel was the golden child from the moment I can remember. He was loud, confident, good at sports, good with people. Teachers loved him. Neighbors loved him. My parents built their entire identity around being Daniel's parents. When Daniel scored a goal in soccer, my father would talk about it for a week. When I brought home a report card full of A's, my father would glance at it and say, "Good, now go help your mother." I was the quiet one, the one who read books instead of talking, the one who noticed everything but said very little. I told myself for years that this was just how families worked. One loud child, one quiet child, and the quiet one learns to stop expecting applause. By the time I was 18, the pattern was set in stone. Daniel went to a state university on a partial scholarship, and my parents threw him a party with a banner that read, "Our future success story." I got into a smaller design and business program 2 states away, on my own scholarship, and my father's only comment was, "Make sure you have a backup plan. Not everyone can be Daniel." I want to be clear about something. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you this because you need to understand exactly how deep the wound was, so that you understand exactly how satisfying the ending is going to be. There's a specific memory I want to share with you, because it explains more than any general description could. When I was 14, I entered a regional science fair with a project on sustainable housing materials, something I'd spent almost 3 months building, a scale model of a house using recycled insulation panels I'd researched from a university paper I found at the library. I won second place out of over 60 entries across the district. I remember running home with the ribbon, so proud I could barely breathe. My father was in the garage when I got home, helping Daniel practice his pitching for an upcoming tryout. I stood in the doorway holding my ribbon, waiting for a pause in the throwing. When my father finally noticed me, he glanced at the ribbon, said, "That's nice, sweetheart," and turned back to catch Daniel's next pitch. Daniel made varsity that season. There was a dinner, there was a cake, My science fair ribbon went into a drawer, and I don't think it was ever mentioned again. I'm not telling you this because I think my father was a monster. He wasn't. In many ways, he was a good provider, a man who worked hard, who loved his family in the ways he knew how. But he had a blind spot the size of a house, and that blind spot had a name, and the name was me. Somewhere along the way, he decided that Daniel's kind of success, visible, loud, easy to explain at a barbecue, counted as real achievement, and mine, quiet, unconventional, harder to summarize in one sentence, counted as something closer to a hobby. By the time I reached my 20s, I had stopped bringing ribbons home, so to speak. I stopped announcing things. I stopped waiting for the pause in the conversation. I learned to build a version of pride that didn't depend on anyone else noticing it, because waiting for that noticing had cost me too many disappointments already. I studied architecture and business development. It wasn't glamorous work in the beginning. I worked internships that paid almost nothing. I lived in a shared apartment with 3 roommates and ate rice and beans more nights than I want to admit. My parents didn't ask about my work. When I tried to explain what I did, commercial property renovation, small-scale real estate development, my father would cut me off and say, "So you flip houses? Like on TV?" And then he'd change the subject back to Daniel's latest promotion at the insurance company where he worked. Daniel, meanwhile, was doing well, genuinely well, in a normal, respectable way. He climbed the ladder at his company, bought a nice car, got engaged to a woman named Kristen, who my mother adored instantly. Every family gathering became, in some way, a celebration of Daniel's life. His engagement, his promotion, his new car, his new house in the suburbs, bought with a loan co-signed, I later learned, by my father. I was happy for him. I want you to know that. I never once wished bad things on my brother. My anger was never about Daniel. It was about the way my parents, especially my father, used Daniel as a measuring stick to make me feel small, year after year, dinner after dinner. When are you going to get a real job, Emily? Daniel's getting a bonus this year. What about you? You should ask Daniel for advice. He knows how the real world works. Each comment was small. Each one, alone, was almost nothing. But small comments, repeated for 15 years, become something else entirely. They become the architecture of how you see yourself. Here's what my family didn't know. While they were busy praising Daniel's steady, visible success, I was building something quiet, something they couldn't see because they never asked the right questions. And that quiet thing was about to become the loudest thing in all of our lives. I need to take you back 4 years before that dinner, to the moment everything actually started. I had been working for a small commercial real estate firm in the city, learning everything I could about property acquisition, renovation, and resale. I was good at it, quietly, steadily good. I noticed patterns other people missed. I found undervalued properties in neighborhoods about to change. I learned how to read a deed, a title report, a zoning map, the way other people read a menu. At 28, I did something that terrified me. I took almost every dollar I had saved, combined it with a small business loan, and bought my first property, a rundown duplex in a neighborhood everyone said was not worth it. I renovated it myself, weekends and evenings, learning as I went. I rented out 1 unit, lived in the other, and within 18 months, I sold it for more than double what I paid. I didn't tell my family, not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned painfully that sharing good news with them usually got twisted into something small, or worse, got quietly credited to someone else's advice. So I kept building in silence. I used the profit from that first duplex to buy a second property, then a third. I formed a small company, Carter Property Holdings, though I used a slightly different registered name for privacy, Maple Grove Ventures LLC, named quietly after the street I grew up on, which still makes me smile when I think about it now. Within 3 years, I owned 6 properties across 2 states, small apartment buildings, a retail strip, 2 duplexes. Nothing enormous by big investor standards, but real, steady, profitable. The kind of portfolio that made bankers take my calls seriously and made my accountant tell me, more than once, "Emily, you're doing better than you think you are." I want to walk you through what those early years actually looked like, because success stories often skip the unglamorous middle, and the middle is where the real character gets built. The duplex I bought at 28 wasn't in a neighborhood anyone was excited about. The street had two boarded-up houses on it. The duplex itself had a leaking roof, outdated wiring that failed inspection twice before I could close on the loan, and a smell in the basement I still can't fully describe. I remember standing in that basement on the day I got the keys, in old jeans and a headlamp, completely alone, wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. For the next 4 months, I worked my regular job during the day and drove to that duplex almost every evening and weekend. I taught myself to patch drywall from online videos. I hired a licensed electrician for the wiring I legally couldn't touch myself. But I did every bit of demolition, painting, and flooring on my own because I couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it. I ate dinner standing up in an empty kitchen more nights than I can count. Too tired to sit down, too determined to stop. When I finally rented out the first unit to a young nurse named Priya, who told me it was the first apartment she'd ever lived in that felt actually cared for, something shifted in me. It wasn't about the money yet. The money was still modest. It was about realizing that I could take something broken and neglected and make it good again, with my own hands and my own judgment, without needing anyone's permission or approval to do it. The second property came faster, because I understood the process better. The third came faster still. By the time I formed Maple Grove Ventures LLC, I had developed something like a sixth sense for undervalued properties. I could walk into a building everyone else dismissed and see, almost immediately, what it could become with the right eye and the right amount of patient, unglamorous work. My family still thought I was figuring things out. At dinners, when they asked what I did, I would say something vague like, "I work in property development," and my father would nod the way you nod at a child who says they want to be an astronaut, polite, unconvinced, already moving on to ask Daniel about his golf game. My mother once asked, with genuine confusion rather than cruelty, "So do you have a boss? Who do you report to?" And when I explained that I ran my own company, she said, "Oh, well, that sounds like a lot of responsibility for someone your age," in a tone that somehow made it sound like a concern rather than a compliment. I stopped correcting the assumptions after a while. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted to believe than to keep offering the truth to people who weren't ready to receive it. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. Honestly, some of it was pride. I didn't want to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was. And some of it was strategy, though I didn't fully realize that yet. Then, about 2 years before the dinner, I got a call that changed everything. It was from a real estate attorney I'd worked with before, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Nguyen. She called to tell me about a property that was coming up for a distressed sale, a foreclosure auction. A house that had fallen behind on a second mortgage the owner had taken out against it. The address she gave me was 214 Maple Grove Lane, my parents' house. I remember sitting perfectly still when Patricia said the address out loud. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Say that again," I said. 214 Maple Grove Lane, she repeated. Owner is Richard Carter. Second mortgage, about $90,000, taken out roughly 2 years ago. Payments have been missed for the last 5 months. It's headed to a foreclosure auction unless something changes fast. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Patricia, sensing something was wrong, asked gently, "Emily, do you know this property?" "It's my parents' house," I said quietly. There was a pause on the line. Then Patricia said, in her calm, careful lawyer voice, "I'm sorry. Do you want me to take you off this deal? I can send it to someone else." I sat there thinking about it, really thinking, because in that moment I had 2 paths in front of me. I could call my father directly and warn him, tell him I somehow knew about the foreclosure, offer to help, open a conversation that would force me to explain who I really was and what I had really built, years earlier than I had planned. I could rescue him quietly, personally, the way a daughter is supposed to. Or I could let the situation unfold on its own for now, learn everything I could about how this happened, and figure out my next move with a clear head instead of a panicked one. I chose to learn first. I asked Patricia to pull the full history of the property, every mortgage, every loan, every filing. What I found explained a lot about why my father had spent the last 2 years talking even more about money than usual, and why he'd suddenly started pushing Daniel to settle down and buy something solid instead of renting. Here's what had happened. 2 years earlier, my father had co-signed a business loan for Daniel, money Daniel used to help cover a down payment on his own house and to invest in what he called a sure thing, a friend's startup that promised big returns. The startup failed within a year. Daniel's own finances took a hit, but because my father had used the family home as collateral to help guarantee part of that loan, my parents' house was now directly at risk. My father hadn't told anyone, not my mother, not Daniel, and certainly not me. He had spent months quietly trying to refinance, quietly falling behind, quietly hoping the problem would fix itself. Meanwhile, at every dinner, he stood up and toasted Daniel's success, while the house under our feet was slipping away because of a decision made to protect that same success. I sat with that information for 3 days before I decided what to do. I remember the first night especially, sitting alone in my apartment with the property records spread across my kitchen table, staring at my father's name on a distressed debt filing, trying to reconcile it with the man who had stood up at every family dinner acting as though nothing in his life could ever go sideways. There was something strangely humbling about it. For years I had measured myself against a version of my father that seemed unshakable. Steady job, steady house, steady opinions about who in the family had figured things out and who hadn't. And here he was, quietly drowning, too proud to tell anyone, including the wife he'd built that steady life with. I thought about calling him that first night. I actually picked up my phone twice, but each time I put it back down because I realized I didn't yet know what I wanted to say, or more honestly, I didn't yet know who I wanted to be in that conversation. The daughter rescuing her father, or something else entirely, something I didn't have language for yet. On the second day, I called Patricia back and asked her every question I could think of. How distressed debt purchases worked, what my options were if I wanted to acquire the note directly instead of letting it go to public auction, what the tax and liability implications would be if I structured the purchase through my LLC instead of personally. I took notes for almost 2 hours, the analytical part of my brain taking over from the emotional part, which I think was its own kind of coping mechanism. By the third day, the decision had settled in me the way big decisions sometimes do, not with a dramatic realization, but with a quiet, almost boring certainty. I wasn't going to let the house go to auction. I wasn't going to let strangers potentially outbid the situation into something messier for my parents. But I also wasn't going to hand my father a rescue with my name stitched visibly across the front of it. Not yet. I wanted to do this the way I had built everything else in my adult life. Carefully, quietly, on my own terms, without asking permission or expecting applause. I could have called my father and offered to pay off the loan directly, as his daughter. Part of me wanted to. But another part of me, the part that had absorbed 15 years of failure, dreamer, figure it out, wanted to see this through differently. I wanted, for the first time in my life, to hold something my father could not dismiss, could not explain away, could not credit to Daniel. So I made a decision that would take almost 2 years to fully play out. I told Patricia to move forward, quietly, through Maple Grove Ventures LLC, not under my personal name. I paid off the second mortgage in full before the foreclosure auction ever happened, working with the lender directly to purchase the debt and then legally acquire the underlying deed through a private sale agreement, structured entirely through my company. On paper, my parents' house was now owned by an LLC. My father, still stunned and quietly panicked about the near foreclosure, was told by the bank that, An investment company had stepped in and purchased the note, allowing him to stay in the house as a tenant under a new lease-to-manage arrangement, paying reduced monthly payments instead of losing the home outright. He was relieved, confused, embarrassed, but relieved. He told my mother it was a private investor who had helped restructure things. He never asked who. He never dug deeper. That was very much like my father. He wanted the problem solved more than he wanted to understand how it was solved. For 2 years, my parents lived in that house, making modest monthly payments to an LLC they knew nothing about, completely unaware that their daughter, the dreamer, the failure, was the person who had quietly kept a roof over their heads. And for 2 years, I said nothing. I let the dinners happen. I let the comments happen. I let my father stand up, glass in hand, and toast Daniel's success in a house that Daniel's failed investment had nearly cost them, in a house that I now owned. I wasn't waiting out of cruelty. I want to be honest about that. I was waiting because I wasn't ready. I was still healing from years of feeling small, and some part of me needed to build my own life fully, my own confidence, my own peace, before I was ready to stand in that dining room and finally be seen. That night, the night of the roast chicken, the toast to Daniel, the words, "Some of us just know how to dream." That was the night I decided I was finally ready. Let me walk you through that evening in full, because every detail matters. My mother had invited the whole family for what she called a small celebration. Daniel had just been promoted to regional manager at his insurance company, a real accomplishment. And I want to be fair, he had worked hard for it. I drove the 2 hours from the city to Maple Grove Lane that Tuesday evening with a bottle of wine and, honestly, a genuine intention to be happy for my brother. The table was set with my mother's good china, the same china that only came out for Daniel's achievements. I'd noticed that pattern years ago and stopped letting it bother me mostly. Daniel's fiancée Kristen was there, glowing, showing my mother wedding venue photos on her phone. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Mike had driven in from 2 towns over. It was a full table, warm light, the smell of roast chicken and rosemary potatoes filling the house. For the first 40 minutes, it was fine. Pleasant, even. I asked Daniel about his new role. I meant it when I said congratulations. I helped my mother carry dishes to the table, the way I always did. The quiet one. Useful, present, unremarkable. I remember small, ordinary details from that stretch of the evening with a strange clarity, the kind of clarity your mind holds on to when it doesn't yet know something painful is coming. My Aunt Carol telling a long story about a cruise she and Uncle Mike had taken, everyone half listening, half eating. Kristen showing my mother 3 different centerpiece options on her phone, my mother genuinely delighted, tapping the screen and saying, "Oh, that one, definitely that one." Daniel topping off everyone's wine glasses, playing the gracious host-in-waiting, even though it wasn't his house. The candles my mother always lit for special occasions, their light flickering slightly every time someone got up to grab something from the kitchen. I remember thinking, somewhere in that 40 minutes, that maybe this dinner would just be a normal one. Maybe I'd drive home afterward feeling the ordinary low-grade tiredness that came from being the quiet one in a loud room. Nothing more, nothing less. I had almost let myself relax into that thought. Then my father stood up. He does this at every major family dinner. Stands, taps his glass with a fork, makes a little speech. Usually it's harmless. That night, it started the same way. "I just want to say," he began, looking at Daniel with real pride in his eyes, "how proud I am of this family. We've built something here. Diane and I worked hard so our kids could have opportunities we didn't have. And Daniel," his voice caught slightly, genuine emotion. "Daniel, you've taken every opportunity and turned it into something real. Regional manager at 34, that's not luck, that's work." Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine too, genuinely, because that part was true and kind and deserved. Then my father's eyes moved to me, and his tone changed, just slightly, just enough that I felt my stomach tighten before he even spoke. "Let's be honest," he said. And I remember that phrase exactly, because it's the phrase people use right before they say something they think is bold and honest, but is actually just cruel. Some of us in this family know how to build something, and some of us just know how to dream. A small laugh moved around the table. My mother's laugh was uncomfortable, quick, the laugh of someone who knows something wrong just happened, but doesn't want to be the one to say so. Daniel laughed louder, not out of malice, I think, but out of the easy comfort of someone who has never once, in his entire life, been on the receiving end of that kind of comment at this table. To Daniel, my father said, raising his glass higher. The only child in this family who actually made something of himself. I sat there. I felt my face grow warm. I felt 15 years of small comments collapse into that single sentence. The only child who actually made something of himself, as if I were sitting at that table for the first time, instead of the 100th. I could have said something. I could have told him, right then, about Maple Grove Ventures, about 6 properties, about the deed sitting in a folder in my home office with his name on the tenant line and my company's name on the ownership line. I could have watched his face change in real time, but I didn't. Not yet. I smiled, a real smile, or close enough to one, picked up my fork and said, "This chicken is really good, Mom." And I kept eating. My mother looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, something like concern flickering across her face. She knew, somewhere underneath the surface, that the comment had landed wrong. But she didn't say anything either. She rarely did. That was its own kind of pain, one I'd made peace with a long time ago. My mother's silence was its own kind of choice. The dinner continued. Wedding plans, golf games, Daniel's new office with a window. I sat quietly, the way I always did, and inside, something that had been building for 2 years finally settled into place. I wasn't angry in the way people imagine anger, hot, loud, reactive. I was calm, unusually calm. Because somewhere in that calm, a decision had already been made. I was done waiting. I drove home that night without crying. I want you to understand that clearly, because for years dinners like that would send me home in tears, replaying every word, wondering what was wrong with me. That night was different. I drove home with a strange, quiet clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes after you stop asking, "Why doesn't he see me?" and start asking, "What am I going to do about it?" The next morning I called Patricia. "I want to formalize the tenancy agreement on 214 Maple Grove Lane," I told her. "Full transition. I want the paperwork updated to reflect standard commercial to residential terms, effective immediately, with a formal notice sent to the current occupants." Patricia, who had handled the original acquisition 2 years earlier and knew exactly whose house this was quiet for a second. "Emily, are you sure you want to do this now? There's no rush. The arrangement has been working fine." "I'm sure," I said. "It's time." Here's what I want you to understand about what I was actually asking for. I wasn't planning to raise the rent to something my parents couldn't afford. I wasn't planning to evict them. I owned the deed to their home. That was true, and it was significant. But my intention was never to take their house away or punish them financially. My intention was much simpler, and honestly, much more personal. I wanted them to know. I wanted my father to open an envelope with an official notice inside, a standard property management letter, the kind that gets sent to every tenant when ownership formalizes, and see, in plain black and white legal language, the name of the entity that owned his home. And I wanted, when he inevitably called that number in a panic, confused about who was contacting him, to be the one who picked up the phone. Patricia drafted the notice. It was completely standard, nothing dramatic, nothing cruel. A notice that Maple Grove Ventures LLC was formalizing property management responsibilities for 214 Maple Grove Lane, effective in 14 days, and included a contact number for questions regarding the lease to manage agreement, monthly payment structure, and property records. I asked her to send it through certified mail, which meant it would take about a week to arrive and require a signature. Which meant I had roughly 11 days between that dinner and the moment my father would finally understand exactly who had been holding the deed to his home. Those 11 days were strange. I went back to work. I was in the middle of renovating a small retail building downtown, meeting contractors, reviewing permits, the normal rhythm of my actual life, the life my family knew nothing about. I didn't call home. My mother texted twice, ordinary things, recipe questions, a photo of Kristen's wedding dress. I responded normally, gave nothing away. On day 9, my father texted me for the first time in almost 3 weeks. It said simply, "Everything okay? Haven't heard from you." I remember staring at that message for a long time. Not because I was unsure what to write back, but because I was struck by something. He had said, "Some of us just know how to dream," 9 days earlier, in front of the entire family, and this was the first time he'd reached out since. Not to apologize, not to check if the comment had hurt me, just a routine check-in, the kind you send when the silence itself becomes slightly inconvenient. I wrote back, "All good, busy with work," which was true, in more ways than he understood yet. On day 11, the letter arrived. I want to pause here and tell you about day 7, because something happened that almost changed my plan entirely. My mother called me, unprompted, on a Sunday evening. Her voice was soft, a little hesitant. "I've been thinking about that dinner," she said. "Your father shouldn't have said what he said. I should have said something at the table. I'm sorry I didn't." It was the first time in 15 years that my mother had directly acknowledged the pattern out loud. Not vaguely, not in passing, directly. I sat on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something in my chest loosen slightly. For a moment, I almost told her everything right then. I almost said, "Mom, there's something you need to know about the house." The words were right there, ready. But I didn't say them. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I realized something important in that pause. This wasn't a secret I was keeping to punish my mother. It was a truth that needed to arrive for my father specifically, in a way he couldn't soften, deflect, or explain away with charm, the way he'd learned to do with almost everything else in his life. If I told my mother first, I worried the truth would get pre-processed before it ever reached him, softened at the edges, delivered gently, robbed of the clarity it needed to actually land. So instead I said, "Thank you for saying that, Mom. I love you." And I let the plan continue. Looking back, I think that phone call was actually the moment I became fully certain I was doing the right thing, not out of anger, but out of necessity. My mother's apology was real, but it was also, in its own way, evidence of exactly the problem. She'd seen the pattern for 15 years and had never once interrupted it in real time. Waiting for people to notice on their own, I had learned, could take a lifetime. Sometimes you have to hand someone the paperwork. I found out later, from my mother, exactly how that morning unfolded, and I've pieced together the rest from what my father eventually admitted, though it took him a long time to admit any of it fully. The mail carrier delivered the certified letter around 11 in the morning. My father was home. He'd cut back his hours at the hardware store the year before, semi-retired, spending more time doing yard work and watching golf than actually managing the business anymore. My mother signed for the letter because my father was out back trimming the hedges. She told me later that she almost didn't think much of it. Property management letters aren't unusual, and since the private investor restructuring 2 years earlier, they occasionally got official mail about the lease-to-manage arrangement. She set it on the kitchen counter and went back to her book club reading. My father came inside around 1, saw the envelope, and opened it standing at the counter. According to my mother, he went very quiet. He read it once, then read it again. Then he said, "Diane, do we know a company called Maple Grove Ventures?" My mother didn't. Neither of them did. The letter itself didn't mention me. Patricia had drafted it as a completely standard business notice, no personal names attached, just the LLC. But something about the name, Maple Grove, the same name as their street, apparently made my father uneasy in a way he couldn't fully explain. He called the number listed on the letter. It rang through to Patricia's office line, which was set up as the general contact number for the LLC's property matters. Patricia, who was expecting this call and had already discussed exactly how to handle it with me, answered professionally. Maple Grove Ventures, this is Patricia. My father, according to what he told me weeks later, asked bluntly, "What is this letter about? I need to speak to whoever's in charge of this company." Patricia's response was calm and measured, exactly as we'd planned. "I can absolutely help you with any questions about the property management transition, Mr. Carter. For questions specifically about ownership matters, I'd recommend reaching out directly to the account holder. Would you like me to arrange that call?" "Yes," my father said. "Today, if possible." Patricia called me 20 minutes later. "He wants to talk," she said. "Are you ready?" I sat in my office, my actual office, in the city, surrounded by property files and renovation blueprints and 6 years of quiet, careful work, and I looked at my phone for a long moment. "Give him my direct line," I said. "I'll take the call." My father called 40 minutes later. I let it ring twice before I answered, not for drama, but because I genuinely needed those extra few seconds to steady myself. "Hello, this is Emily," I said. There was a long pause on the other end, a pause so long I almost thought the call had dropped. "Emily?" my father said, his voice strange, confused. "Emily, why is your number listed for this Maple Grove Ventures company? What's going on?" I took a breath. "Dad," I said, "I think it's time we talked. In person. Can I come by tomorrow?" I drove to Maple Grove Lane the next afternoon. My mother had called Daniel, I found out later, worried, unsure what was happening, and Daniel had shown up too, which meant that when I arrived, all three of them were sitting in the living room, tense, waiting. I want to describe this moment carefully, because it's the moment everything I'd been carrying for 2 years, and honestly for 15 years before that, finally came into the light. The drive over felt longer than 2 hours, even though the roads were the same ones I'd driven 100 times before. I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, rehearsing sentences in my head that I knew I'd probably abandon the moment I actually walked through the door. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside me the whole way, and I kept glancing at it at every red light, as if checking that it was still real, that this moment was actually about to happen after 2 years of careful, silent planning. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed my father's truck parked at an odd angle, like he'd pulled in quickly, distracted. Daniel's car was already there too, which told me my mother had called him the moment she hung up with me the day before, unable to sit with this alone. I sat in my car for almost a full minute before going inside, taking slow breaths, reminding myself that whatever happened in the next hour, I had already done the hard part. The house was safe. My family was safe. Everything after this was simply about the truth finally catching up to the people who needed to hear it. I walked in carrying a folder, the same folder I'd built over years, containing the original mortgage documents, the foreclosure notice from 2 years earlier, the private sale agreement, the deed itself with Maple Grove Ventures LLC listed as owner, and finally, the LLC's registration documents, listing me, Emily Carter, as sole managing member. My father stood up when I walked in. "Emily, what is this about? Why are you connected to this company that owns?" He stopped, and I watched something shift in his face, a calculation happening in real time. "Wait, does this company own our house?" "Sit down, Dad," I said gently. "I'll explain everything." I sat across from them and opened the folder. I laid it out calmly, without anger in my voice, though my hands, I remember, were not entirely steady. 2 years ago, I said, you took out a second mortgage on this house to help cover part of Daniel's loan for his down payment and his investment in Mark's startup. When the startup failed, you fell behind on payments. The house was headed to a foreclosure auction. A private company purchased the debt and restructured your payments so you could stay here without losing the house. That company is Maple Grove Ventures. I am the owner of Maple Grove Ventures." The room went completely silent. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Daniel sat forward, his face pale. "You," my father said slowly, "you bought our house?" "I paid off the debt that was about to take your house away," I corrected gently. "The deed transferred as part of that transaction, yes. You've been paying a reduced monthly amount to my company for 2 years, which is significantly less than what the original mortgage payment would have been, and far less than what you would have lost if the foreclosure had gone through." "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This was the question I had thought about the most in all those quiet months of planning, and I answered it as honestly as I could. "Because I wasn't ready to be seen yet," I said. For 15 years, every time I tried to talk about my work, about what I was actually building, I got interrupted, or dismissed, or compared to Daniel. I stopped trying to explain myself because it never seemed to matter. So I stopped needing you to understand, and I just kept building on my own. My father's face had gone through several expressions in the span of a few seconds: confusion, disbelief, and now something that looked almost like shame, though he wasn't ready to name it yet. "But you let me stand there," he said, his voice tightening, "at dinner, and say those things to you. About Daniel. About—" He stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. "Yes," I said quietly. "I did." "Why?" His voice cracked slightly. I looked at him directly, and for the first time in my life, I said the thing I had needed to say for 15 years. "Because for once, Dad, I wanted you to find out the truth in a moment you couldn't control. I wanted you to feel, just once, what it's like to have your assumptions about someone completely fall apart. I have owned this house for 2 years. I have 6 other properties. I have built a business you've never once asked a real question about. And at every single dinner during those 2 years, you stood up and told this family that Daniel was the only one who made something of himself in a house that I own." Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice quiet. "Emily, I didn't know any of this. About the loan, about the house, about any of it." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "This was never about you, Daniel. I've never resented your success. I resented being erased next to it." My mother was crying quietly now. My father sat very still, staring at the folder on the coffee table, at the deed with my company's name on it, at 15 years of assumptions collapsing in real time. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. I remember every small detail of that silence, because it was the loudest silence I had ever sat inside. Finally, my father spoke, his voice rough. 2 years, he said. "You've known for 2 years, and you sat at this table, and you let me." He stopped, pressing his hand against his forehead. "At Daniel's birthday, at Christmas, at Easter, I kept saying things, and you just sat there." "Yes," I said again, steady. "Why didn't you stop me?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice wasn't defensive, it was genuinely searching. "Why didn't you just say something?" I thought carefully before I answered, because I wanted to give him the truest answer I had, not the easiest one. "Because I'd tried to say something before, Dad. Different words, different years. I tried to tell you about the duplex when I bought it. You asked if I was sure that was smart. I tried to tell you about my second property, and you asked if I was going to actually keep a stable job eventually. Every time I offered you a piece of the truth, you handed it back to me smaller than I gave it to you. So I stopped offering pieces. I decided that the next time you found out the truth, it would be too big to hand back." My father sat with that for a long moment. Daniel, beside him, was quiet, his jaw tight, clearly processing his own version of this same reckoning. the golden child suddenly seeing, for the first time, the shape of the shadow he'd unknowingly stood in. "I don't know what to say," my father finally admitted, and for a man who had never once, in my memory, said those exact words, it landed heavier than any apology could have. "You don't have to say anything right now," I told him. "I didn't come here for an apology. I came here because I was done watching you build a story about this family that wasn't true. I wanted you to have the real one. I want to be honest with you about something. This story doesn't end with me kicking my parents out, or delivering some dramatic final line and walking out the door forever. That's not what happened, and honestly, that's not who I am. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways harder. I told my father, that same afternoon, that nothing about his living situation was going to change. He and my mother would continue living in the house, under the same manageable payment terms, for as long as they needed. I wasn't interested in punishing them financially or taking anything away. What I wanted, what I had always wanted if I'm honest, was simply to be seen accurately, not praised excessively, not treated as some hidden hero, just seen clearly for who I actually was. My father struggled with this for weeks. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when a belief they've held for years turns out to be wrong, and my father moved through that silence slowly. He called me about 10 days later, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I've been thinking about that dinner," he said. "About a lot of dinners, actually. I think I built a story in my head a long time ago about which of my kids was the success and which one needed managing. And I never once asked you what you were actually doing with your life. I just decided." "I know, Dad," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know how to fix 15 years in one phone call, but I want to try." I won't tell you that everything became perfect after that. Old patterns don't disappear in a single conversation, and there were still moments in the months that followed where old habits crept back in. A slightly dismissive comment, a lingering assumption. But something had genuinely shifted. My father started asking real questions about my work. He asked to see one of my renovation projects. He stood in a half-finished retail space I was converting into apartments, looked around at the exposed brick and the new framing, and said quietly, "I had no idea you knew how to do all this." "You never asked," I said, not unkindly, just honestly. Daniel and I actually grew closer after that dinner, strangely enough. He called me privately a few weeks later, late on a Thursday night, and I could tell from the first few seconds of the call that he'd been thinking about what to say for a while. "I need to apologize for something," he said, "and I've been putting it off because I didn't know how." "Okay," I said, sitting down on my couch, giving him the space to get there. "I laughed," he said, "at the dinner. When Dad said that thing about you just knowing how to dream. I laughed, Emily. I didn't even think about it. It was just this reflex, because that's how our family always talked, and I never once stopped to ask why it was funny, or whether it should have been funny at all." He paused. "I've been thinking about it a lot since everything came out. About how easy my whole life has actually been, compared to yours. Mom and Dad clapped for everything I did, even the small stuff. And you built an entire company, quietly, saved this family's house, and the loudest reaction you ever got was Dad standing up to make fun of you." I felt something in my chest soften, hearing him say it plainly like that. "I never blamed you for any of it, Daniel," I said. "You didn't create the pattern. You just grew up inside it, same as me. It just built you up instead of tearing you down." "I want to understand your work," he said. "Really understand it. Can I come see one of your properties sometime?" He did, about a month later. I walked him through a small apartment building I was converting from an old textile warehouse, showing him the exposed beams we'd preserved, the layout changes, the permitting headaches, the budget spreadsheets I kept color-coded by project phase. He asked real questions. He seemed, for the first time in our adult lives, genuinely curious about who I actually was, instead of who our family had always assumed I was. We talked that afternoon, about the pressure he felt being the successful one, the expectation that never let up, the fear of ever disappointing our parents, the way even his promotions sometimes felt less like joy and more like relief that he hadn't messed anything up yet. It turns out both of us had been carrying something heavy at that table, just different shapes of the same weight. My mother took the longest to adjust. I think, in some ways, she carried the most guilt, because she had noticed the pattern for years and said nothing. We had a long conversation, one evening over tea at her kitchen table, the same table from that dinner, just the two of us this time. No candles, no good china, just two mugs and honesty. "I saw it," she said, turning her mug slowly between her hands, not quite looking at me. "I saw how your father talked to you, differently than Daniel. Every birthday, every holiday, every little thing. I told myself it wasn't that serious. Kids tease each other, parents have favorites sometimes, it evens out eventually. I told myself all of it, every version of it, for years. I'm sorry I let myself believe that instead of doing something about it." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, not accusingly, just honestly wanting to understand. She was quiet for a long moment. "Because your father and I built our whole marriage around not disagreeing with each other in front of you kids. I thought that was strength. I think now it might have just been avoidance wearing a nicer name." She finally looked up at me, her eyes wet. "I should have been the one to stand up at that table instead of you having to fix it with a folder full of paperwork. I'm sorry it took a real estate deed for this family to finally tell you the truth." "It's okay, Mom," I said, and I meant it mostly. "We're here now." I forgave her. I forgave all of them eventually. Not because what happened didn't matter, but because holding on to it forever wasn't the kind of life I wanted to build, especially not now, with everything I actually had built sitting solidly around me. I want to end this story with a scene, because I think it says more than any explanation could. 6 months after that dinner, my mother invited the family over again. A smaller gathering this time, just to celebrate Daniel and Kristen's engagement party moving one step closer. Some final wedding planning milestone I don't even fully remember now. The same dining room. The same good china. The same smell of rosemary and roast chicken drifting through the house. But it felt different the moment I walked in. My father greeted me at the door, and instead of the usual quick hug and immediate pivot toward Daniel, he held onto my shoulder for an extra second and said, "I saw the article about the retail conversion downtown, the one in the local business paper. That's really something, Emily." He'd apparently gone looking for it himself, without me mentioning it, after I'd told him about the project months earlier. We sat down to dinner, and about halfway through the meal, my father stood up the way he always does, tapping his glass with a fork. My stomach tightened out of old habit, an instinct I don't think will ever fully leave me. "I want to say something," he began, and I've been thinking about how to say it for a while now. He looked at Daniel first. "Daniel, I am proud of you. I've always been proud of you, and I always will be." Daniel nodded, smiling. Then my father turned to me, and for the first time in my entire life, at that table, in that house, his eyes found mine with something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. "Emily," he said, "I spent a long time not seeing what you were actually building, because I decided a long time ago what kind of success was supposed to look like. I was wrong. You didn't just build a business quietly for 6 years. You held this family together when I put us at risk, and didn't even have the courage to tell anyone. You could have let this house go to auction. You could have let me sit in that shame publicly, the same way I let you sit in yours at every dinner for 15 years. Instead, you fixed it silently, and you never once used it against me until I gave you a reason to. I don't think I've ever told you how much that means. So I'm telling you now, in front of everyone. I am proud of both of my children. Equally. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." The table was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of that earlier dinner, but something gentler. Something that felt, for the first time in my memory, like the truth settling into a room instead of being pushed out of it. I didn't cry, though I came close. I raised my glass instead and said, "To second chances, and to finally being seen." Everyone raised their glasses with me, and this time, when Daniel laughed, it wasn't at my expense. It was just a warm, ordinary laugh, the kind families are supposed to share. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the guests had gone home, my mother walked me to my car. She hugged me for a long moment, longer than usual, and said, "I'm proud of you too, you know. I always have been. I just didn't know how to say it in a house where your father's voice was always the loudest one." "I know, Mom," I said. "It's okay now." And driving home that night, past the same streets I'd driven 100 times before, past the hardware store my father used to run, past the school where I'd carried home a science fair ribbon that went into a drawer and stayed there for 18 years, I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to peace. Here's what I learned, and here's what I want you to take from this story, whatever version of this you're living through right now. Sometimes the people who are supposed to see us clearest are the ones who see us the least. Not because they don't love us, but because they've built a story in their heads that's easier than the truth. My father didn't dismiss me because he hated me. He dismissed me because comparing me unfavorably to Daniel required no effort, no real attention, no risk of being wrong. It was simply easier than actually asking who I was. For 15 years, I let that comparison define how small I made myself at that table. And the turning point wasn't the moment I bought that house. It was the moment I stopped needing my family's applause to know what I had built was real. I didn't buy that deed for revenge, not really, even though it might look that way from the outside. I bought it because it was a smart business decision that happened to involve people I loved. The revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't in owning the house. It was in finally, quietly, refusing to shrink myself for one more dinner. If you're sitting at a table right now where someone keeps calling you the dreamer, the failure, the one who just needs to figure it out, I want you to hear this clearly. Their opinion of your work is not the same thing as the truth of your work. Keep building, even in silence, especially in silence. Let your life speak in a language they eventually can't argue with. And when the moment comes, and it will come, you don't have to raise your voice. You don't have to prove anything with anger. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is set a folder gently on the coffee table, look the person who doubted you directly in the eye, and let the paperwork speak the truth you were never given room to say out loud. My father called me a failure at that dinner table, but the deed said otherwise, and now so does he.